It started as a simple conversation on live television, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not through raised voices or dramatic walk-offs, but through a calm, measured disagreement that slowly reshapes the tone of the entire table. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began the way many daytime talk show conversations do, with a relaxed introduction and a light atmosphere. Tom Hanks was welcomed onto the set of The View to promote his latest project, and the initial exchanges were warm and familiar. The hosts greeted him with the kind of ease that comes from years of seeing him on similar shows, and the audience responded with enthusiastic applause. There was no sense at first that anything unusual was about to happen. Hanks appeared comfortable, smiling, seated casually with his hands folded in front of him, leaning slightly forward as he listened to the opening questions. The early part of the conversation focused on his career, his long-standing relationship with audiences, and the themes of the new project he was there to discuss. The hosts took turns asking about his approach to storytelling, his interest in real-life narratives, and how he chooses roles at this stage of his career. Everything felt standard, even predictable. Hanks spoke in his usual thoughtful way, answering without rushing, often pausing to consider his words, and occasionally making the audience laugh with understated humor. The shift in tone began subtly when the discussion moved toward a broader topic connected to the film, something involving social issues and how public figures use their platforms. One of the hosts framed it as a conversation about responsibility in media and entertainment. Joy Behar, as she often does, leaned into the political angle of the topic, offering her perspective with a slightly sharper edge than the earlier, lighter questions. She made a comment about celebrities needing to be more vocal and more direct when addressing current social and political issues, suggesting that staying neutral or cautious could be interpreted as avoiding responsibility. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried a firmness that stood out compared to the relaxed mood just moments earlier. The camera briefly cut to Hanks, who was nodding, but not in full agreement. His expression shifted slightly, not confrontational, but clearly reflective. Hanks responded calmly, starting with an acknowledgement of her point. He said he understood the desire for public figures to speak up, and that he believed in using influence thoughtfully. But he added that not every situation benefits from loud or constant commentary, especially when the issues are complex and people are still processing them. His voice remained even, and he avoided framing his response as a rebuttal, instead presenting it as an alternative perspective. Joy listened, but then followed up by pressing the point, saying that silence, even when well-intentioned, can still send a message. She suggested that audiences look to figures like him precisely because of his credibility, and that choosing not to speak could feel like missed leadership. Her body language became more animated, her hands moving slightly as she emphasized certain words. At this moment, the studio atmosphere changed just a bit. It wasn't tense in a dramatic sense, but viewers could sense that the conversation had shifted from friendly promotion into something more serious. Other hosts began to glance between Hanks and Joy, clearly aware that the exchange was becoming more layered. The audience, too, seemed quieter, listening more closely rather than reacting with laughter or applause. Hanks took a moment before answering again, and that pause itself was noticeable. On live television, even a few seconds of silence can feel longer than they are. He looked toward Joy, then briefly toward the other hosts, as if acknowledging the group dynamic of the conversation. When he spoke, his tone remained steady and respectful. He said that he didn't view silence as avoidance, but sometimes as restraint. He explained that he tries to be careful not to oversimplify issues that deserve more than sound bites or emotional reactions. He mentioned that while he believes in advocacy, he also believes in listening, learning, and choosing moments carefully rather than responding to every headline or controversy. Joy responded by saying that while she respected that approach, she felt that the current climate demanded more urgency. She pointed out that people in influential positions have access to platforms that most individuals don't, and that choosing when not to use them can have real consequences. Her tone was still controlled, but more pointed now, and her facial expression suggested she felt strongly about the issue. This is where the disagreement became clear to the audience. It wasn't a clash in the traditional sense, no raised voices or interruptions, but a genuine difference in philosophy. Hanks leaned back slightly in his chair, not defensively, but as if giving himself space to think. He nodded again, acknowledging her point, but then calmly pushed back. He said that influence comes with responsibility, but also with the risk of being misinterpreted or contributing to noise rather than clarity. He explained that he's wary of being seen as an authority on topics where experts and affected communities should be centered instead. He framed his position not as withdrawal, but as an effort to avoid overshadowing other voices. The hosts around the table reacted subtly. One of them offered a small nod. Another leaned in as if preparing to add a comment, but then held back. It was clear that the conversation had reached a point where interruptions might disrupt the natural flow. The producers, likely watching from behind the scenes, allowed the exchange to continue without cutting to commercial or redirecting the topic. The audience remained attentive. There were no audible gasps or cheers, just a focused quiet that often accompanies serious discussions on daytime television. This wasn't the kind of moment that generates viral clips through shock, but the kind that draws attention because of how calmly and thoughtfully it unfolds. Joy replied once more, saying that she understood the concern about overshadowing others, but that she believed the public often needs recognizable figures to amplify important conversations. She emphasized that she wasn't asking for perfection, just presence. Her voice softened slightly here, shifting from argument to explanation. Hanks smiled faintly, not dismissively, but in a way that suggested appreciation for the exchange. He said he agreed that presence matters, but that presence can take many forms. Sometimes, he said, it means stepping back rather than stepping forward. He stressed that he doesn't see his role as leading every conversation, but participating when he feels he can contribute meaningfully without simplifying or distorting the issue. At this point, one of the other hosts gently stepped in, acknowledging that both perspectives had merit. She reframed the discussion as a difference in approach rather than a conflict, suggesting that the real question was how public figures balance influence with humility. This helped ease the moment and brought the tone back toward a more inclusive discussion. Joy nodded, and Hanks nodded as well. There was no sense of unresolved tension, just the feeling of two people expressing different viewpoints within a respectful framework. The conversation moved on to related topics, including how audiences interpret celebrity statements and how media cycles amplify certain voices over others. As the segment continued, the earlier disagreement lingered subtly in the background. Hanks remained engaged, but slightly more reserved, choosing his words carefully. Joy, too, seemed more reflective, asking follow-up questions rather than making strong declarations. The other hosts contributed more actively now, creating a broader panel discussion rather than a focused exchange between two individuals. For viewers watching at home, the moment stood out precisely because of how understated it was. There was no dramatic music, no awkward cut to commercial, no visible discomfort. Instead, it felt like a real conversation that could happen at any table, just broadcast to millions of people. The calm pushback, the measured responses, and the absence of hostility made it feel authentic. By the end of the first part of the segment, it was clear that this wasn't a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a genuine disagreement about public responsibility and communication. Hanks had pushed back, not by rejecting Joy's point, but by reframing it through his own philosophy. Joy had pressed, not to provoke, but to challenge what she saw as an important issue. And in that quiet space between their perspectives, the audience witnessed something rare on live television. A moment where disagreement didn't escalate into spectacle, but settled into thoughtful dialogue, leaving viewers with more to consider than to react to. As the conversation continued, the hosts subtly tried to widen the scope so it wouldn't feel like a one-on-one exchange, but the underlying tension between the two perspectives was still present. The camera work reflected this shift, alternating more evenly between all the panelists instead of focusing primarily on Tom Hanks and Joy Behar. This is often how live talk shows manage moments like this, by distributing attention and allowing multiple voices to reshape the tone. One of the other hosts brought up how audiences today consume media differently, noting that social platforms often reward the loudest or most extreme opinions. She asked Hanks whether that environment makes him more cautious about speaking publicly, especially knowing how easily statements can be taken out of context. Hanks nodded slowly, and his response leaned into the point she was making. He said that part of his hesitation comes from exactly that dynamic. He explained that even thoughtful comments can become headlines stripped of nuance, and that once something is reduced to a few words on a screen, it no longer belongs to the person who said it. His tone was calm, but there was a seriousness underneath, suggesting this was something he'd clearly reflected on before. Joy responded by saying that while that's true, the same system also means silence can be interpreted in equally extreme ways. She pointed out that in the absence of clear statements, people often project their own assumptions onto public figures. Her argument wasn't framed as criticism of Hanks personally, but more as a general reality of modern media culture. The audience reacted with light applause at this point, not strongly favoring either side, but acknowledging the relevance of the topic. It was one of those moments where the studio response felt more like agreement with the complexity of the issue rather than with a specific person. The energy in the room remained serious but not uncomfortable. Hanks replied by saying that he accepts that people will project regardless of what he does or doesn't say, and that part of being in the public eye is learning to live with interpretations you can't control. He said he tries to focus on actions rather than statements, supporting causes privately and directly instead of always publicly. He emphasized that public visibility isn't the only form of engagement, and sometimes not the most effective one. Joy leaned forward slightly and said she respected that, but questioned whether private action without public advocacy loses some of its impact. She explained that when well-known figures speak, it often encourages others to pay attention or get involved. Her tone here was less challenging and more inquisitive, as if she genuinely wanted to understand where he drew the line. This shift in her delivery softened the exchange. Hanks responded by saying that he doesn't see it as an either-or situation. He acknowledged that public advocacy can be powerful, but stressed that it shouldn't become a performance. He said he worries about a culture where people feel pressured to comment on everything, even when they don't have something meaningful to add. One of the hosts chimed in, saying that viewers often expect celebrities to have fully formed opinions on complex issues, even though those issues take years of study and lived experience to understand. She asked whether that expectation itself is unfair. Hanks agreed, saying that being well-known doesn't automatically make someone well-informed. Joy smiled at that and said she didn't expect perfection or expertise, just honesty and presence. She clarified that her earlier point wasn't about forcing celebrities into roles they didn't want, but about recognizing the influence they already have. Her body language relaxed slightly, and she leaned back in her chair, signaling that the exchange was becoming more conversational than confrontational. The conversation now felt less like disagreement and more like collective reflection. The hosts took turns adding small comments, sharing examples of times when public statements had sparked positive change, and also times when they had caused confusion or backlash. The segment evolved into a broader discussion about the responsibilities and limitations of public influence. Throughout all of this, Hanks remained composed, never raising his voice or appearing defensive. His manner was consistent, listening carefully, nodding when others spoke, and responding thoughtfully. Joy, too, maintained her characteristic directness, but her tone had shifted from pressing to exploring. For viewers at home, the moment likely felt familiar in a different way. It resembled conversations people have with friends or family, where no one is trying to win, but everyone is trying to be understood. The disagreement didn't disappear, but it became more nuanced, less about opposing sides and more about different approaches to the same concern. The audience responded intermittently with light applause, especially when hosts made points about empathy, complexity, and the pressure of public life. There was no sense of a divided crowd, just general engagement. The producers allowed the segment to run slightly longer than usual, suggesting they recognized the value of the discussion. At one point, Joy made a comment about how audiences often look for certainty in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. She said that seeing someone like Hanks speak calmly and thoughtfully, even when he disagrees, might actually be more impactful than making bold declarations. This was one of the first times she directly acknowledged his style as a form of influence in itself. Hanks smiled at that and said he appreciated the way she framed it. He agreed that calm communication has its own value, especially in an environment where everything feels amplified. He said he doesn't want to contribute to division, and that his instinct is always to look for common ground rather than clear sides. This statement seemed to resonate with the other hosts, who nodded and added brief comments about the importance of dialogue over debate. The conversation had now fully shifted away from tension and into something more reflective and collaborative. Still, the original disagreement hadn't disappeared. It remained as an underlying contrast between urgency and caution, between public advocacy and private action. But instead of being framed as a conflict, it now felt like two valid philosophies coexisting. As the segment approached its midpoint, the hosts began transitioning back toward the original topic of Hank's project, but the tone of the conversation had been permanently altered. Even when discussing the film again, the questions were now framed through the lens of responsibility, influence, and communication. Hanks answered these new questions with the same measured approach, often linking the themes of the film to the broader discussion they'd just had. Joy asked about how the story reflected real-world issues, and Hanks responded by saying that storytelling itself can be a form of social engagement, sometimes more effective than direct commentary. This remark subtly tied the entire exchange together. It suggested that his way of contributing wasn't through constant public statements, but through the work he chooses to create and support. Joy didn't challenge this point. Instead, she nodded and said that storytelling does shape public perception, whether people realize it or not. The audience reacted with applause, and for the first time since the disagreement began, the energy felt lighter again. Not because the topic had become less serious, but because the conversation had reached a place of mutual understanding. For viewers, this was likely the moment when the initial tension fully dissolved into something more constructive. The disagreement had been real, but it hadn't turned into spectacle. Instead, it had evolved into a rare example of how live television can handle differing perspectives without forcing resolution or conflict. And in that sense, the calm pushback that defined the exchange had done exactly what it needed to do. It didn't shut anyone down, and it didn't escalate. It simply created space for a deeper, more thoughtful conversation, one that felt authentic, unscripted, and grounded in the realities of modern public life. As the conversation moved forward, the producers gently guided it into a new phase, one that still carried the weight of what had just been discussed, but allowed the panel to explore it from a slightly different angle. This is a common technique on live daytime shows, where a topic isn't abruptly dropped, but slowly reframed so it can evolve without repeating the same points. The hosts began talking about audience expectations more directly, especially how viewers relate to celebrities in a way that feels personal, even though the relationship is entirely one-sided. One of the hosts mentioned that people often feel they know Tom Hanks because of how long he's been in the public eye and the kinds of roles he's played. She asked whether that familiarity creates pressure to live up to an image, not just as an actor, but as a person with certain values. Hanks smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggests both recognition and mild discomfort. He said that he's aware people project qualities onto him based on his characters, and that he doesn't take that lightly. He explained that there's a difference between being approachable and being accessible, and that while he appreciates the trust audiences place in him, he's careful not to confuse that with authority or moral leadership. His voice was steady, but the topic seemed more personal than earlier parts of the discussion. Joy listened closely and then said that this is exactly why people look to him. She pointed out that trust, once built, becomes influence whether someone seeks it or not. She said that audiences don't separate the roles from the person as much as celebrities might hope, and that this emotional connection is part of what gives public figures their power. This brought the conversation back into the same philosophical space as before, but now with a more emotional dimension. Hanks responded by saying that he understands that connection, but that he's cautious about accepting the label of moral voice, because it puts unrealistic expectations on any individual. He said that no one person should be treated as a compass for millions of others. The audience was very quiet during this part, more so than earlier. There was no laughter, no applause, just focused attention. The studio felt like it had shifted into a reflective mode, where people weren't reacting but absorbing. Even the hosts spoke more slowly, choosing their words carefully. One of them asked whether Hanks ever feels conflicted about staying quiet on certain topics, especially when he knows people expect him to speak. Hanks admitted that he does. He said there are moments when he wonders whether silence is the right choice, and that he doesn't always get it right. He emphasized that his approach isn't about avoiding responsibility, but about avoiding simplification. Joy followed up by saying that uncertainty itself can be valuable if it's communicated honestly. She suggested that even acknowledging doubt publicly can be a form of engagement. Her tone here was noticeably softer than at the start of the segment, less about pressing a point and more about offering an idea. Hanks nodded and said that's a fair point. He explained that part of his hesitation comes from a desire to speak only when he feels he can contribute constructively, not emotionally. He said that the pressure to react quickly often leads to statements that feel performative rather than thoughtful. Another host added that the speed of media today leaves very little room for reflection, and that silence is often treated as absence instead of processing. She said that maybe audiences need to become more comfortable with waiting, with not having immediate answers from the people they admire. This seemed to resonate with Joy. She agreed that the expectation of instant commentary can be unhealthy, not just for celebrities, but for everyone. She said that social platforms have trained people to expect constant opinions, even when situations are still unfolding. The discussion now felt almost philosophical, moving beyond the original disagreement into a broader examination of how public discourse works. Hanks remained the central figure, but he was no longer in a defensive position. Instead, he was part of a collective conversation about influence, responsibility, and communication. At one point, Joy made a comment about how daytime television itself plays a role in shaping these expectations. She said that shows like theirs often ask guests to respond to complex topics in very limited time, and that this format can unintentionally encourage simplified answers. This self-awareness brought a brief moment of laughter from the audience, as it acknowledged the limitations of the very platform they were watching. Hanks laughed as well and said that's one of the reasons he prefers longer conversations, where nuance has room to exist. He said that real understanding usually happens off camera, in private discussions that don't need to be condensed into sound bites. This comment seemed to subtly reframe the entire segment. It suggested that what viewers were witnessing was already a compromise between depth and accessibility. The calm disagreement with Joy earlier now felt like part of a larger tension between thoughtful discourse and the demands of live television. Joy responded by saying that while she loves debate, she also appreciates moments like this, where disagreement doesn't feel adversarial. She said that too often, people treat opposing views as personal attacks rather than opportunities to learn. Her body language was relaxed now, her hands resting on the table instead of gesturing emphatically. Hanks agreed and said that respectful disagreement is one of the few ways people can actually grow. He said that being challenged doesn't mean being disrespected, and that he values conversations where he's asked to examine his own assumptions. The audience reacted with applause, this time a bit stronger than before. It wasn't directed at a specific statement, but at the overall tone of the exchange. It felt like a collective acknowledgement that something meaningful was happening, even if it wasn't dramatic. As the segment continued, the hosts began sharing personal anecdotes about times they'd felt pressured to speak or remain silent on public issues. These stories grounded the discussion in everyday experience, making it less about celebrity and more about human behavior. Hanks listened to each story attentively, occasionally nodding or smiling, but rarely interrupting. When he did speak, it was usually to connect their experiences to his own, reinforcing the idea that these dilemmas aren't unique to fame, just amplified by it. Joy shared a moment from her own career when she felt torn between expressing an opinion and maintaining balance on air. She said that over time, she learned that speaking honestly doesn't always mean speaking loudly. This was a subtle shift from her earlier stance, and viewers could sense that the conversation had influenced her perspective as well. Hanks responded by saying that this kind of self-awareness is exactly what he tries to practice. He said that he's still learning, and that he doesn't see his approach as fixed or perfect. He framed it as an ongoing process rather than a settled philosophy. This openness further softened the dynamic. The original disagreement now felt like the starting point of a deeper dialogue rather than a conflict that needed resolution. The hosts, the guest, and the audience were all participating in a shared exploration of how people communicate in public spaces. By this point in the segment, the tone had become almost intimate, despite the studio setting and the cameras. The conversation slowed down, with fewer interruptions and more thoughtful pauses. Even the background noise of the studio seemed quieter, as if everyone was collectively leaning in. For viewers at home, this part of the exchange likely felt less like watching a talk show and more like listening to a long-form conversation. It wasn't about headlines or viral moments anymore. It was about ideas, values, and the subtle ways people negotiate responsibility in a world that constantly demands attention. And while the disagreement between Tom Hanks and Joy Behar had sparked this shift, it was their calm, respectful engagement that sustained it, turning a simple on-air difference of opinion into a rare moment of genuine dialogue on daytime television. As the segment entered its later stage, there was a noticeable shift in energy. not because the topic had become less serious, but because the conversation had settled into a rhythm. The initial tension had transformed into something more stable, a shared understanding that disagreement didn't have to be resolved in order to be meaningful. The hosts seemed more relaxed now, speaking less from prepared positions and more from personal reflection. One of the hosts brought the discussion back to the audience perspective, pointing out that many viewers watch shows like this precisely to see how public figures handle difficult conversations. She said that moments of disagreement, when handled calmly, can be just as impactful as moments of agreement. The comment felt like an indirect acknowledgement of what had just unfolded between Hanks and Joy. Hanks responded by saying that he hopes people don't look at conversations like this as examples of who's right or wrong, but as examples of how people can talk to each other. He emphasized that tone matters as much as content, and that how something is said often determines how it's received. His delivery was gentle, almost instructional, without sounding preachy. Joy nodded and added that she thinks viewers are tired of conflict for the sake of conflict. She said that while debate is important, there's a difference between disagreement and hostility, and that television sometimes blurs that line. Her voice was noticeably calmer than at the start of the segment, and her posture reflected that, leaning back slightly, hands resting comfortably on the table. The audience responded with soft applause, not loud or enthusiastic, but appreciative. It was the kind of reaction that suggests people felt seen or understood rather than entertained. The moment didn't feel like a climax, but like a pause, a collective breath. Another host mentioned that one reason this conversation stood out was because it didn't follow the usual structure of daytime TV, where topics are quickly introduced, debated, and wrapped up within a few minutes. She said that allowing space for nuance might not always be exciting, but it can be more honest. This comment seemed directed as much at the producers as at the viewers. Hanks smiled at that and said that honesty often looks boring compared to drama, but it's usually more productive. He said that he's had plenty of experiences where intense emotions created memorable television, but not necessarily meaningful outcomes. He suggested that the quieter moments are often the ones people remember later, even if they don't go viral. Joy agreed, saying that some of the most important conversations she's had on the show never became headlines. She said that the value of those moments isn't measured in clicks or views, but in how they affect people who are genuinely listening. This was a notable shift from her earlier emphasis on visibility and urgency, and it didn't go unnoticed by the other hosts. One of them gently pointed out that this conversation itself was an example of that kind of moment. She said that it wasn't dramatic, but it felt real, and that's often what resonates most with long-term viewers. The audience applauded again, slightly louder this time, as if recognizing the meta-nature of what was being said. Hanks acknowledged this by saying that he appreciated being part of a discussion that didn't feel forced. He said that too often, talk show appearances are about delivering clear messages or sound bites, and that this felt different. He described it as a conversation that was allowed to breathe, to change shape as people spoke and listened. Joy smiled and said that sometimes the best segments are the ones that weren't planned that way. She admitted that she came into the discussion with a strong opinion, but that hearing Hanks explain his perspective made her think differently about how silence and restraint can function in public life. This was the closest she came to explicitly acknowledging that her view had shifted. Hanks responded by saying that her questions made him reflect as well. He said that being challenged respectfully is one of the few ways people can test their own assumptions. He emphasized that he didn't see their exchange as a debate, but as a mutual examination of ideas. The hosts collectively agreed with this framing, and one of them summarized the moment by saying that what viewers had just seen was not a disagreement to be resolved, but a conversation to be continued. This line felt like a natural bridge toward wrapping up the segment. The producers began subtly signaling the transition, with the hosts glancing toward the camera and adjusting their posture. But the tone remained reflective rather than rushed. Joy asked one final question, more personal than political, about how Hanks decides when a conversation is worth having publicly and when it's better kept private. Hanks took a moment before answering, longer than he had earlier in the segment. The pause was noticeable, but not awkward. It felt intentional, as if he was choosing his words carefully. When he spoke, he said that he usually asks himself whether what he's about to say will add clarity or just noise. If it feels like noise, he said, he tries to listen instead. Joy nodded slowly and said that's a good guideline for anyone, not just public figures. The audience responded with a brief but warm round of applause, the the kind that signals agreement rather than excitement. The segment began to wind down, and the hosts shifted back into the familiar rhythm of daytime television, thanking Hanks for joining them and briefly promoting his project again. But the atmosphere was different from how it had started. There was a sense that something unscripted and genuine had taken place, something that couldn't be easily summarized in a single takeaway. As the camera pulled back slightly, showing the full table, the body language of everyone involved reflected that shift. The hosts leaned toward each other more naturally. Hanks sat comfortably, smiling, and Joy appeared relaxed, even reflective. For viewers, this part of the segment likely felt like the emotional resolution, not because the disagreement had ended, but because it had transformed. What began as a difference in opinion had evolved into a shared exploration of how people communicate, influence, and listen. There was no clear winner, no final argument, no dramatic closing statement. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that the conversation itself was the point. And in the context of live daytime television, that kind of ending felt surprisingly rare. The disagreement between Tom Hanks and Joy Behar had never escalated into conflict, but it had also never been smoothed over. It remained present, acknowledged, and integrated into a broader discussion about responsibility, restraint, and the role of public voices. And as the segment faded into the next topic, it left behind a lingering impression, not of tension, but of thoughtful exchange, the kind that doesn't demand agreement, only attention. As the show moved into its final moments, the hosts transitioned smoothly into the closing rhythm that viewers of daytime television are very familiar with. There was no abrupt shift, no obvious attempt to summarize the disagreement in a dramatic way. Instead, the tone remained steady and reflective, as if everyone at the table understood that the segment had already said what it needed to say. The main host thanked Tom Hanks again for joining the panel and for taking part in what she described as an honest and thoughtful conversation. This phrasing felt intentional, almost like a subtle acknowledgement that the discussion had gone beyond the usual promotional interview. Hanks responded with a polite smile and said he appreciated the chance to talk about things that don't always fit neatly into short answers. Joy added a brief closing comment, saying that conversations like this are why she still enjoys doing live television, because you never fully know where a topic will lead. Her tone was warm, not confrontational, and she looked directly at Hanks as she said it. He nodded in return and said that unpredictability is what keeps dialogue real. The studio audience applauded, this time more fully and confidently than at any earlier point in the segment. It wasn't the loud, excited applause reserved for celebrity entrances, but a sustained, appreciative response. It sounded like the kind of applause that follows something people felt was meaningful rather than entertaining. As the camera cut to a wider shot of the table, viewers could see the relaxed body language of everyone involved. The hosts leaned back in their chairs, smiling and exchanging brief glances with one another. Hank sat comfortably, hands resting on the table, no longer in the more forward, engaged posture he'd maintained during the heavier parts of the discussion. Joy looked calm, almost reflective, her earlier intensity replaced by a quieter demeanor. The show moved on to its next segment, but for many viewers, the conversation with Hanks likely lingered in their minds. It wasn't the kind of moment that demands immediate reaction or sparks obvious controversy. Instead, it was the kind that slowly registers, prompting people to think about how they interpret public voices and their own expectations of them. Almost immediately after the episode aired, social media began reflecting that same tone. There were no explosive clips circulating with dramatic captions. Instead, short excerpts of the exchange were shared with comments, focusing on how respectful and grounded the conversation felt. Many viewers pointed out how rare it was to see a disagreement on live television that didn't turn into a debate or a spectacle. Some posts highlighted Joy's original point about the importance of speaking up, while others emphasized Hank's perspective on restraint and listening. What stood out was that most reactions didn't frame the moment as one person being right and the other being wrong. Instead, people discussed the balance between visibility and responsibility, often referencing their own experiences with speaking out or staying quiet. Several viewers commented that the segment felt more like a podcast-style discussion than a typical daytime TV exchange. They noted the lack of interruptions, the thoughtful pauses, and the way both sides seemed genuinely open to reconsidering their positions. For longtime viewers of the show, this stood out as a departure from the usual fast-paced, opinion-driven format. Media outlets that covered the episode described it in similar terms. Rather than focusing on conflict, headlines emphasized the calm tone of the disagreement and the depth of the discussion. Some articles framed it as an example of how talk shows can still create meaningful moments without relying on controversy or emotional escalation. Behind the scenes, according to later comments from people associated with the show, the segment wasn't planned to unfold that way. The original outline was meant to focus mostly on Hank's project, with a brief detour into broader social themes. The extended conversation happened organically, driven by the natural exchange between Hanks and Joy. This was evident to viewers as well. The moment didn't feel staged or rehearsed. There were no sharp transitions, no forced conclusions. It unfolded the way real conversations often do, slowly, with shifts in tone, moments of disagreement, and gradual movement toward understanding rather than resolution. In follow-up interviews days later, Joy mentioned that she appreciated how Hanks responded to her questions, saying that it reminded her of the value of listening as much as speaking. She noted that while she still believes strongly in public advocacy, the conversation made her think more carefully about how people choose when and how to use their voices. Hanks, in a separate appearance on another program, briefly referenced the exchange as well. He said that he enjoyed the discussion and that it reinforced his belief that disagreement doesn't have to be confrontational to be meaningful. He described it as a reminder that public conversations can still be thoughtful, even in environments that usually prioritize speed and simplicity. For many viewers, this follow-up only added to the sense that the segment had been something genuine. It wasn't designed to go viral, but it resonated because it felt real. People shared it with friends not because it was shocking, but because it reflected the kinds of conversations they wished were more common in public spaces. In the days after the episode, fan discussions focused less on who made the stronger argument and more on how the exchange itself was handled. Comments praised the calm tone, the mutual respect, and the absence of personal attacks. Some viewers even said it changed the way they think about speaking up in their own lives, especially in situations where emotions run high. What made the moment stand out wasn't the topic itself, which had been discussed countless times on television before. It was the way the topic was approached. There was no sense of performance, no attempt to score points or deliver perfect lines. Instead, there was a gradual unfolding of ideas, shaped by listening as much as speaking. In the context of daytime television, where conversations are often compressed into clear positions and quick reactions, this felt different. It showed that live TV can still create space for uncertainty, reflection, and evolving perspectives, even within the limits of a studio format and a scheduled segment. The disagreement between Tom Hanks and Joy Behar never became a confrontation, and it never needed to. It served its purpose simply by existing, by allowing two thoughtful people to express different views and explore them openly in front of an audience. By the end of the week, the segment had quietly become one of the more talked about moments from the show, not because of controversy, but because of its tone. It was remembered as a rare example of how disagreement can look when it's grounded in respect and curiosity rather than urgency and performance. And in that sense, the moment didn't really end when the cameras cut away. It continued in the conversations viewers had with each other, online and offline, as they reflected on what they'd seen and how it connected to their own experiences. It wasn't a viral moment in the traditional sense, but it was a lasting one. A reminder that sometimes the most impactful exchanges on television aren't the loudest or the most dramatic, but the ones that leave people thinking quietly long after the show moves on to its next topic. And now, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.